All right, let's talk about ADHD, or attention deficit slash hyperactivity disorder. Now, this is a condition that affects millions of people, but the story behind it, how we diagnose it, well, it's often really misunderstood.
You might be surprised to hear that the story of ADHD doesn't actually start in a modern clinic. Nope. It kind of starts with these characters from 19th century German cartoons. You had Fidgety Philip and Johnny Head in the Air. These were some of the first popular depictions of kids who, just couldn't seem to sit still or pay attention.
Now, obviously, these weren't clinical diagnoses, but they were some of the very first times that people documented and observed behaviors that we now recognize as the hallmarks of this condition. It was the first sign that doctors and teachers were really starting to notice and try to figure this stuff out. But the journey from those old-timey sketches to how we understand it today, it's a really fascinating story. It's a story of science evolving, of moving away from moral judgments and toward neurobiology. Okay, let's get into it.
The way we've understood these behaviors has shifted, and I mean dramatically, over the last 100 years or so. It really mirrors some major changes in how we think about medicine and psychology as a whole.
What's really wild to see here is the shift in thinking. I mean, it went from being seen as a moral failing, like a lack of willpower, to being understood as a medical diagnosis. By the 1980s, the game completely changed. The focus was now totally on behaviors you could actually see and measure, and that right there paved the way for more consistent diagnoses and a ton of scientific research. So that brings us to the big question, right? What actually causes ADHD? And the answer, well, it's not simple. It's this really complex dance between our biology and the world we happen to live in.
This quote just nails it. It gets right to the heart of the matter. See, ADHD has very clear roots in our neurobiology, but how it shows up and whether or not it even becomes a problem is super heavily shaped by our environment and the pressures of society.
So you've got two sides of the same coin. On one hand, there's strong evidence for genetics, for differences in brain chemistry, like the dopamine system, but on the other hand, you have the demands of modern life, like sitting still in a classroom for hours, that can make those underlying biological traits way more obvious. It can turn what might just be a difference into an actual disorder.
Okay, so keeping all that complexity in mind, how in the world do clinicians actually diagnose ADHD today?
Well, for starters, you need to know that the rulebooks are different depending on where you are in the world. In the US, they mostly use the DSM, which defines a pretty broad condition where you can have mainly inattentive symptoms. But the World Health Organization's ICD defines a much more severe condition called HKD, which requires symptoms in all three areas: inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. That makes it a much rarer diagnosis.
This is a huge one. It's a question people ask all the time, hoping for a simple, objective yes or no. But the reality is a little more complicated than that.
So here's the deal. There are tools, like an EEG, that can show brainwave patterns that we often see with ADHD. For instance, a higher ratio of slow wave to fast wave activity. But, and this is the crucial part, they just aren't reliable enough to diagnose the condition all by themselves. The diagnosis is still a clinical one, meaning it's based on behavior and a person's history. A proper diagnosis isn't a quick checklist. It's a super detailed process. It's honestly a lot like detective work. It involves structured interviews, digging up old school reports to see if the symptoms started in childhood, and talking to different people in the person's life. The real key is to confirm that the symptoms are causing significant problems in major areas of life, like at school, at work, or in relationships.
So once someone has a diagnosis, what's next? What does effective management actually look like? Well, the evidence is pretty overwhelming that the best approach is multimodal, meaning it's very rarely just one thing.
Back in the 1990s, this absolutely massive, game-changing study called the Multimodal Treatment Study of ADHD, or MTA, was launched. It was designed to really put different treatment approaches to the test, head-to-head.
So what they did was they took nearly 600 kids and split them into 4 different groups. One group got carefully managed medication only. Another got intensive behavioral therapy. A third group got both, and the last group just got the typical care you'd get from your local doctor. And after 14 months, the results were crystal clear. Now, everybody got better, which is great, but the groups with the carefully managed medication and the combined treatment, they had a much bigger reduction in their core ADHD symptoms. They were flat out superior to just behavioral therapy alone or standard community care.
This was huge because it gave us really strong scientific proof for just how effective medication can be when it's managed properly.
Building on all that knowledge, today's best practice is really like having a toolbox. You start with education, just understanding what's going on. Then you add behavioral strategies for parents and schools. Medication, both stimulants and non-stimulants, is an incredibly effective tool for managing symptoms, and it's often used right alongside psychotherapy, especially for adults. But, reducing symptoms is a huge goal, but it's really only part of the story. What does it actually mean to live with ADHD, especially as you get older and move into adulthood?
Well, if it's left unmanaged, the challenges can go way beyond just focus. They can really affect a person's ability to hold down a job, to maintain relationships, to regulate their emotions. And all of that often leads to a lower quality of life and, unfortunately, a higher risk for other mental health conditions.
And this slide shows something that is so crucial to understand because it trips a lot of people up. The classic image we have of a kid who is just driven by a motor, constantly running around, that often transforms into adulthood. That physical hyperactivity frequently turns into this more subtle internal feeling of restlessness, like an inability to relax, constant fidgeting, or a brain that just will not turn off. And this brings us right back to that idea of ADHD being a cultural phenomenon. It leaves us with a final thought to chew on. In a world that demands more and more focus, more and more productivity, what's the future for a brain that just works differently? Are we going to find better ways to accommodate neurodiversity, or is the pressure to conform just going to keep rising? It's a really big question, and the answer will definitely shape the story of ADHD for years to come.